Deep within the labyrinthine concrete of the Pentagon's Ring 4, the air has a specific weight. It tastes of ozone, old paper, and the recycled breath of men who haven't seen the sun in days. For Elias Thorne, this was the sound of silence. A sterile, windowless existence where the only color came from the harsh blue light of his dual monitors. Elias wasn't a soldier or a strategist, he was a senior archival analyst, a high-level digital janitor tasked with cleaning records before they were moved to public storage. His fingers danced across the keys, deleting names, blurring faces, and sanitizing the history of a nation that preferred its myths over its reality. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. Elias's workstation was a lonely island in a sea of shifting shadows. The corridors of Ring 4 were whispers of suppressed history, but today the silence was broken by a digital glitch. A file directory that shouldn't have existed flickered onto his screen, a phantom known as a ghost file. It was labeled Project Chimera. The metadata suggested these documents were marked for incineration in 1953, yet through some clerical oversight during the mass digitization of the late 90s, they had been swallowed into the server instead of being fed to the flames. He hesitated, his cursor hovering over the forbidden icon. With a sharp intake of breath, he clicked. Grainy, high-resolution photographs from the late 1940s filled his screen, shattering his professional composure. They weren't the blurry, indistinct blobs usually associated with vintage sightings. These were crisp images of metallic, an oblong craft, smooth, white, and wingless. They looked exactly like the tic-tac UAPs reported by modern Navy pilots. The realization hit Elias like a physical blow. The technology hadn't evolved because it was already perfect decades ago. Our understanding was the only thing lagging behind, intentionally kept in the dark by the very institution he served. As he scrolled through the encrypted pages, a familiar name caught his eye in a redacted pilot's report. It was his father's handwriting in the margins, scrawled with an urgency that transcended time. Captain Arthur Thorne had been a decorated pilot until the night he reported a silent, triangular craft pacing his jet over the Pacific. He was grounded, labeled insane, and spent his final years in a haze of bitterness, clutching drawings of lights that defied gravity. On looking at the Chimera files, Elias felt a surge of cold fury. His father wasn't a victim of madness. He was a victim of a meticulously maintained, state-sponsored lie. "The screen is quite bright today, isn't it, Elias?" The voice was like dry parchment. Elias didn't need to look up to know Director Vance was standing behind him. Vance was a career bureaucrat, a man who seemed to be made of gray suits and cold pragmatism. He was the one who monitored every keystroke, the one who reminded the staff that national security was a wall built of necessary lies. Vance's hand rested briefly on the back of Elias's chair, a subtle reminder of the surveillance that never slept. Elias felt the sweat pooling at the small of his back as he quickly minimized the window, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. Like the internal conflict gnawed at him. He was only 3 years away from a comfortable pension, a quiet life of gardening and forgetting. But the Chimera files were a siren song he couldn't ignore. Under the cover of a routine data backup, he began to secretly copy the files onto a localized air-gapped drive hidden in his palm. As the progress bar crawled forward, he skimmed the sensor readings. These weren't interstellar travelers. The physics logs suggested the crafts weren't arriving from distant stars. They were emerging from deep ocean trenches. They were elsewhere on Earth, a hidden neighbor we had never acknowledged. The stakes reached a fever pitch when Elias accessed a command memo dated just last week. It was a direct order signed by the Joint Chiefs. Project Chimera was to be permanently archived, a euphemism for a total digital wipe, within the next 48 hours. The history of his father, the truth of our planet, and the evidence of the biological custodians were about to be erased forever. Elias felt the weight of the drive in his pocket. He was no longer just an analyst. He was a thief of secrets, and his world was about to catch fire. The humidity of the DC summer had been replaced by a biting synthetic chill as Elias Thorne stepped into the subterranean depths of Union Station. His heart was a frantic drum, every beat echoing the stolen weight of the Chimera drive. He moved through throngs of commuters, searching for the one person who could help him burn the wall of lies down. Sarah Jenkins sat on a chipped wooden bench, a discarded newspaper in her lap, or wearing a look of practiced indifference. A year ago, she had been a Pulitzer-chasing investigative journalist. Now she was a ghost, disgraced by a poisoned leak designed to bury her reputation. "You're late," she whispered, eyes never leaving the arriving train. Elias didn't sit. He leaned against a pillar, his gaze scanning the crowds for signs of a tail, earpieces, too still posture, and darting eyes. "The Pentagon is a large house to rob," Elias whispered. He didn't waste time. He told her about the files, about the limited hangout the public had been fed. Released videos were tactical distractions, a crumb to keep the masses from looking for the loaf. The real files weren't about grainy footage. They were about biological recoveries and the entities called the custodians, beings hidden in the deep folds of our world. Sarah's composure cracked, fear crossing her face. "You mean they aren't just drones?" Elias shook his head, as autopsy reports from 1947 seared his mind. "They aren't invaders, Sarah. They've been here longer than us. We're living in their guest house." As he spoke, a man in a Navy windbreaker paused at a vending machine. Elias felt a cold shiver. The encrypted line he'd used hadn't been secure. The cleaners were closing the net, and the air in the station suddenly felt dangerously thin. Flickering station lights triggered a sharp memory of his father's final hours. Captain Arthur Thorne was a shell, eyes burning with clarity. "The lights, Elias," he had whispered, gripping his son's wrist with surprising strength. "They didn't just fly. They spoke without words. They told me we weren't ready, but the men in the suits, they're trying to build weapons out of things meant for peace." At the time, Elias thought it was delirium. Now he realized it was a confession from a man punished for seeing the truth, a pilot who had touched the sun and was burned by the shadow of the state. "We have to move," Elias hissed, grabbing Sarah. They boarded the train just as doors shut, leaving the pursuer on the platform. Inside the screeching tube, Elias opened his laptop, showing Sarah biological logs. The custodians weren't gray men from Mars. They were organisms with hive consciousness that the government spent billions to weaponize. Files detailed horrific, failed experiments in reverse engineering consciousness that had failed utterly. They reached Sarah's apartment in a blur. The small space felt like a sanctuary, but peace was short-lived. Just as Elias showed her the map of hotspots where the atmosphere thinned and craft entered, the front door was kicked off its hinges. "Cleaners!" Sarah screamed. They scrambled for the fire exit as black-clad figures flooded the room, red dots of laser sights dancing across the wallpaper. They tumbled into rainy streets, splashing through puddles as the cold DC night swallowed their screams. The rain was a silver curtain, obscuring the path. Elias realized the Pentagon used technology stolen from the custodians to track them. The hotspots weren't just in the ocean. One was directly beneath the National Mall. In a dark alley, Elias's phone buzzed. It was a text from a blocked number. "We know you have the Chimera drive. Look up." Elias slowed, tilting his head toward the storm-tossed sky. Above the Washington Monument, clouds parted. There was no sound. A massive, silent, triangular craft blurs the stars, shimmering with violet distortion. It was a witness to their flight, a predator waiting in the high, dark heavens. The rain-slicked outskirts of Washington, D.C. blurred into a gray haze as Elias Thorne and Sarah Jenkins reached their final sanctuary. It was an abandoned analog radio station, a skeletal structure of rusted iron that stood as a relic of a pre-digital age. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of stagnant dust and scorched ozone. Elias knew the Pentagon's tactical teams would be scouring every digital fiber of the city, but here, among the humming vacuum tubes and copper wiring, their sophisticated surveillance was blind. Sarah's hands trembled as she patched the Chimera drive into the massive broadcast antenna, bypassing the modern internet's choke points to hit the satellites directly. 50 terabytes of raw reality, Sarah whispered, her face bathed in the amber glow of the terminal. If we press that key, Elias, the world stops existing as we know it. There is no going back to the comfort of the lie. Elias didn't hesitate. He began the bypass sequences, watching the progress bars ignite like fires on the screen. This was the grand leak. He was broadcasting unedited sensor data, telepathic communication logs, and the biological blueprints of the custodians to every major university news organization and laboratory on the planet simultaneously. The heavy steel door creaked on its hinges, but there was no flashbang. Instead, Director Vance stepped into the light alone. He looked fragile, his sharp gray suit rumpled and his eyes heavy. He didn't reach for a weapon. He simply stood there, watching his life's work dissolve. "The world isn't ready, Elias," Vance said, his voice a dry rasp. "The social contract is built on the belief that we are the masters of this domain. You release this and you shatter every religion, every economy, and every government. You aren't a hero. You are the architect of a global collapse." Elias looked at the man who had perfected the necessary lie. He thought of his father, Arthur, who had died in a narrow hospital bed, his reputation fractured by the truth Vance had suppressed. His father had been labeled a madman for seeing the neighbors the government wanted to ignore. "The chaos isn't in the truth, Vance. It's in the cage you built to keep us in the dark," Elias replied. "My father wasn't broken by what he saw. He was broken by the men who told him his eyes were lying." With a steady breath, Elias pressed the execution key. The send command bypassed the final firewall, and the data screamed across the global network. Across the world, the silence was shattered. Within minutes, high-definition footage of shimmering underwater bases in the Marianas Trench began to flicker onto billions of smartphones. Physicists stared at zero-point energy equations that rendered fossil fuels obsolete in a single heartbeat. But the telepathic logs were what truly changed the human soul. Thousands of recorded interactions where the custodian spoke of Earth as a shared garden. The realization hit the public like a wave. We were never the owners of this planet, merely the newest tenants. Vance let out a weary sigh. The sound of a man relieved of a burden he could no longer carry. Outside, the wail of sirens grew deafening, and the thud of tactical boots echoed. Elias felt a cooling peace settle over him. As the doors were kicked open and he was forced onto the concrete floor, he didn't feel the bite of the handcuffs. He looked into the lens of a news camera already broadcasting his face to a transformed world. He was a prisoner, but for the first time, his mind was free. The aftermath was a slow realignment. Religions found new meanings, and science was reborn. Politics shifted from borders to the shared reality of a crowded planet. High above the National Mall, the triangular craft Elias had seen finally descended. It did not hide. It hovered silently, a monument to the end of our isolation. The screen fades to black as the final quote scrolls into view. "They have always been here. We were the ones hiding.